I've just thought I'd chip in with a Fred video that's been kicking around. It's about why we collect records and how we collect them and all the ramifications of that. Because clearly there are a large number of people that do. So I thought I'd describe a little bit of my history with regard to this very strange hobby. I've got to really go way back really, with my story to encapsulate what I want to say really. When I was a young boy, and we're talking about 5 or 6 years of age, back in 1960, I developed an interest in cars, toy cars. And in fact, so much so that I pestered my father every day of every week. And he relented most Saturdays, and we used to trope down to the toy shop in the centre of town. This is in Guildford in Surrey. And I would choose either a dinky toy or a Matchbox car, and I would come home happy as Larry. And this developed into a ritual really, and I collected a lot of dinky cars and Matchbox cars, and I still have them. They were transported to Thailand along with me, and they sit in a couple of boxes. They're all in pretty desperate need of a repaint, but I thought stupidly really many years ago that I'd keep them for my son. I won't go into the details, but I ain't got one, although I did have one briefly. So I've still got them, and I consider this to be the start of my craving. Now this craving for dinky toys I quickly used to float into a fantasy world. My parents didn't get on that well, and it was a pretty sort of charged environment for a child to grow up in. There was myself and my older sister, 6 years my senior, and we suffered considerably really emotionally on having to listen to our parents constantly bickering at each other, and sometimes it got rather out of hand. So consequently it was pretty easy at mid-primary for me, with the benefit of my collected cars, to slip into this fantasy world where I was creating Grand Prix races in the living room and allocating drivers to all the cars. And of course, my father and I had an interest in motor racing, and he helped me with all the history of those drivers that are infamous. And I named them all for my cars, and I went through this ritual of having a sort of a race periodically and pushing these cars around the room while the adults watched TV. So anyway, it laid the foundations for collecting. And so I better move on now, otherwise this is going to be too long. Once we got into secondary school and early adolescence, most people were starting to gravitate towards an interest in music. Now, in our household, it has to be said that music was around in abundance via the radio. My mother daily listened to the radio. Well, she had it on. I'm not quite sure whether she was doing any listening. My sister, of course, was 6 years my elder, and she developed an interest in music, pop music. And we're talking about now 1962, 63. I was 9 years of age, and then moving forward into early secondary, 65. And I can remember my sister enjoying the birth of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and certainly Motown is a very vivid memory in my head. Elvis a little bit, but he had got his best days had probably passed. But it wasn't sufficient for me to really get stuck into it at this age. Football was basically on my mind 24/7. But then when we got into adolescence, teenage life, and it was 1968 and 69, a number of my peers, my friends, started to get quite into music, particularly psychedelic, progressive, heavy music. And I was sort of being towed along, really. And so I opened my ears to this as well. And it certainly proved to be a stepping stone in my musical love affair. About 1968, I do recall one incident that probably had a radical effect on me. I had two close friends, one of which was pretty much into this new music that he'd been picking up from America and from the UK. He was a big Byrds fan, Buffalo Springfield, and on the English side, he started to appreciate such bands as Jethro Tull. And I remember going to his house one day after school, and he sat me down and he said, "John, listen to this." And this very small record player, which was basically for singles, he put this 12-inch LP on it with a very, very odd sort of yellow centre. And out from these squeaky little tinderbox speakers came this music that I'd never heard before in my life. The album was Wazza Wazza by the Edgar Broughton Band, who at that time were considered to be extremely heavy underground music. And I have to say, my ears pricked up and I thought, wow, this is certainly something I'd like to get into. So I then moved not too far after this, started to buy records myself. Now, I bought a couple of singles by Jethro Tull, that band had started to break into the singles charts. I think the first one I bought was Sweet Dreams, not on an album, and then The Teacher. But then I quickly moved on to albums. This was becoming quite important in the peer group. You know, if you wanted to be sort of in the group, then you need to be owning some sort of music. And so I didn't know a lot about the bands at that stage, but I'd heard a little bit about a band called Cream. And so I went out and bought my first LP, and it was Best of Cream, a compilation, and it became my first Pride of Place album in my collection. And that basically set the torchlight going, and I quickly followed with an island sampler where I got a taste of Jethro Tull, Free, and many others that were on that. And I think I did this on a previous video. And then I also, drugs of course started to filter into the equation. And so there was a little bit of indulgence. And then I met some guy who was into Jimi Hendrix. And, well, that was it. I submerged myself into Electric Ladyland, and complete with joint in hand, I was way on the way now to becoming an addicted music collector. Bought that album, and it also filtered in very nicely with becoming friendly with some of the ladies as well, and of course we adorned ourselves in these ridiculous hippie haircuts and clothes, and so the vinyl took off, so to speak, and I quickly started buying records. Now you might ask how. Well, I was still at school, and then I moved on to college and got a grant, but prior to that my father was the source. I didn't buy too many, but he was always willing to make me happy. But when we got to college, I got a grant from the government, and half of that, I guess, at least half, because I was still living with my parents, went on buying albums. And so from the 71, 72, 73, 74, my collection got out of control, really, with those albums. So I've got a huge amount of albums from that era. So after college, work arrived, but my buying of albums didn't. One of my friends had moved out of the local town, Guildford, and he'd taken him down to art college in Eastbourne. And I used to go down there for weekends, and he would drag me over to Brighton, and there were a couple of record shops, second-hand record shops, and oh my goodness, this was like being in sort of nirvana. We used to go over there every time I went down, and of course we marched out with an armful of LPs. They were all dreadfully cheap. The shop was run by two gay men who were delightful, really, in helping you get to know the albums, and I bought lots of stuff from there. And moving on, I then started going to a lot of concerts, not just in my hometown, but I started to go up to London, most of which on my own. I was the only one that seemed to have any balls to do the travelling up. And I used to go to the Hammersmith Odeon. We're talking about now, I was in my early 20s, and so it's 1976, not a bit later, maybe 78, 7, and I would go up there and see the gig, and I saw some great acts up there, I can tell you. But I also found a record shop near the Odeon, not too far away, so I used to dive in there and buy another wad of albums and take them into the theatre, and then get the last bus back at about midnight and arrive back in my hometown at sort of 2 in the morning, and then I walk home and sneak in with my key. My parents didn't seem to bother. And so I started to buy more and more albums from that place as well. The room was getting clogged up. Let's fast forward a bit to basically I moved back to Nottingham to work after a period in college there, and my buying continued at a hell of a rate, because I was now earning good money. But then, to cut a long story short, my mother died, and she left me quite a bit of money. Me and my sister got 50%, and I at that time had sort of collided, it's probably the best way to describe it, collided with some young woman and got involved in a relationship. And mainly me, I decided that I wanted a break from social services. And when I was a very young boy, in my teenage, back with the guy who took me to his house and introduced me to the birds, we used to regularly sit down with a map of the world and plan out where we were going to go. And I'd had a bit of an experience of Europe before on a rail ticket, so I was very travel orientated. And as I say, I met this girl in Nottingham, and I decided it was about time to give this social services a bit of a pass, because it was very, very stressful. And so I suggested to this girl that we go on a round the world ticket, and we bought a ticket. Now, she was quite a few years younger than me, so she was really keen, come from a rich family, but I was funding it. Yeah. And so we went off and got married in near New Zealand in the Cook Islands, and then continued through New Zealand and Australia, and then into Asia. Took Walkmans with us, and by that stage had been buying cassettes because, of course, travelling we couldn't take vinyl with us, so we had a few cassettes. But when we hit Bali, well, you can guess, can't you? Got to Bali, the first thing I noticed when we woke up the following day in this tropical paradise, with it was an amazing experience. Flowed over from Darwin. The culture shock was, well, I've never experienced anything like it. But I soon gravitated to vendors who were selling Western music. So, of course, started to buy some cassettes. My new wife put the brakes on that because we were having to carry everything. So we didn't get too many, but it sort of kept the sort of the desires going. And then by the time we got to Singapore, we were then not getting copies, but we bought some top class cassettes, but they were still really cheap. And I remember buying, I can remember six cassettes that we bought, four in Bali and a couple in Singapore, maybe four, more than four. Midnight Oil, who were the big Australian band, you know, they were everywhere. Michael Jackson, Off the Wall. Terence Trent's Derby, I can remember his first solo. And one other, which escapes me. But in Singapore, I picked up Sting's The Soul Cages, and the brand new album by Prefab Sprout, which was from Langley Park to Memphis. Oh, and that was it was tremendous to get my teeth into that. And then Thailand followed. A briefing about Thailand. This addiction continued. There were a few other things that I got addicted to in Thailand. But then I found in Thailand, in Bangkok, the infamous Khao San Road. Now, Khao San Road is basically one street for foreigners, and they all go there on their travel logs. Either they're coming back from Australia through Indonesia, or they've come from India and Nepal and they're on their way to Oz. But basically, it was just a collection of guest houses, bars, restaurants, and, yeah, you guessed it, cassette shops. Well, they were on the street, really, cassette stalls, and all of Western music. And they were copies, and they were 50 pence or something like ridiculous. And so guess what? Yeah, I bought a hell of a lot of them. And by the time I came back from Thailand, I think I had possibly 50 of these cheap copy cassettes of all the latest stuff. We're talking about 1989. So you find what was released in that year, and I'd probably have bought it on cassette. So back to the grind now, and back in Nottingham, and the addiction continues. Back with vinyl now, and then CDs appeared. So Nottingham again, the addiction continues. The room was getting fuller and fuller. Got quite a few cassettes now. CDs were starting to dribble in through the front door, but it was still mainly vinyl. And I used to go, there was a good shop in Nottingham, cheap vinyl, but I also, when I went down to see my father, I'd always go through London and stop at the record and tape exchange, it was called. There was 4 or 5 of them, and this was the place to buy second-hand vinyl. And I'd always come out with an armful there. And they continue in the tale, because when I then went back into social services after a period trying something different because of the money, but it was taking its toll on me, and I basically, to cut a long story short, I decided that I had to try and find a way out. So in 1992, 93, I started to get quite depressed about the work, and my marriage fell to pieces. And so eventually I took some time off for depression, and I came back to Thailand for a holiday, and into the record, the cassette place again. And to cut a long story short, I got myself set up with a Thai girl, and brought her back to the UK, and eventually in 93 decided to leave. So what am I going to do with all these damn records? I had 2,000 plus vinyl records. I asked a friend to take care of some, and he said, "You got to be joking." So basically I went down to the record shop in London and offloaded over 1,000 vinyl LPs. Almost cried. I kept a couple of hundred, and they're here in Thailand with me, but I never play them because I haven't got a record player. But maybe sometime in the future. And so my arrival here again, it was back to cassettes, and then we started to get sort of DVDs, CDs, sorry. So I started buying them, and then the internet arrived, and guess what? I decided it's time to go to digital. So anyway, I ended up, and I'm now, I think this year, I've downloaded at least 250 new albums released this year. Let me just give you a little taste. Okay, I dug these out of the boxes just to show you that I have got vinyl. Of course, I've got virtually all Elvis Costello up until early 90s, this year's model. And this guy I took a fancy to, Lloyd Cole in the Commotions. There's another Elvis one, Trust. So those are the few. I've got about 200. Steely Dan collection, complete up to Gaucho anyway. And then there's the cassettes, of course, Tracy Chapman, yeah. CDs I can't put my hand on at the moment. But anyway, I don't know if you can see these. These are the zip drives that now I have virtually all my music collection on. It's a bit of a far cry from the vinyl, isn't it? But this is progress. So anyway, that's my tale. Why do we collect it? Well, I think the idea of having a possession that's with you all the time is pretty crucial. A lot of other so-called things that you possessed is probably the wrong word, but you are with, often break. For example, cars, relationships, health. No guarantees on these things, whereas your collection is there with you. It's also, I think, quite a male thing, although there are women that do have collections, but far more men. I think it's sort of part of being with that peer group, and it's an assertion of how you're up there, you know, at the front of the queue when it comes to what's new and what's great. Look what I've got. And it's also becomes a sort of like a child, really, and you look after them just as you would a child, because you value them so much. But I'm not an expert. And of course, that adrenaline kick of buying new. When I listen to people on the VC talking about going to car boot sales and fairs, it rekindles my memories of going to those shops and to the car boot and to record fairs. I did a little bit of that. So that's my tale on collecting.